Perfect. Okay. All right. So like I said, I like to just do a quick intro. So for everyone listening, thank you for being my first author guest on the podcast.
You're welcome.
As a fellow author, I've really wanted to have more authors on. So this is fantastic. So I'm here today with Gordon Anthony Bean. He is a horror and dark fantasy author, primarily several novels and short story anthologies. Do you want to just give a little bit of background, tell us a little bit about who you are and just like a quick intro?
Sure, absolutely. So I've been writing probably my whole life. I probably would say I published my first book maybe a decade ago. And it's something I like to do on the side. My writing itself, it's kind of an interesting process because a story comes to me and all of a sudden I just have to get it down on paper and just get it out there. And that's always been the genesis of everything I write. But, I mean, writing isn't everything I do. I work full-time. Right now I'm actually an empty nester for the first time. My daughter's off in college, and I'm looking forward to actually having a little bit more free time to do some more writing. So
Yeah.
I've got a lot of projects in the works, so I'm excited to get those going.
Yeah. So you've been saying you've been writing for a long time. So has it always been a passion for you since you were a kid? When did like the need to write kind of start?
Yeah, it's always been a passion. For example, in elementary school, I used to write short stories. In high school, actually in elementary school, I got a story that won an award in our local writer's journal. In high school, I had a teacher who basically told me, she goes, "You're probably the best writer I've ever had in my entire teaching career." So, for a teenage kid, that really makes you like, "Oh, look at that. I'm good at something." But at the age of about 17, 18, I decided I wanted to write a book. So I did. I wrote it all out on paper, and then I lost it. So I rewrote it on a computer, had everything set, the story, I changed it, the genesis changed over the years on that, and the computer died. I tried everything. I couldn't access the file. So I was frustrated, so I did it again. I rewrote it a third time. Now this time, I completely re-edited the whole story. I changed the plot. And at the end of the day, I made multiple copies this time.
You're like, I've learned my lesson.
Yeah. That's the book that I'm currently editing. It hasn't been released yet, but it's funny because that's the one I wrote decades ago, and I feel like it's the best work I've ever done.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the universe is always interfering on where we're supposed to be, right? So it probably took those first two drafts away from you for a reason because it wasn't the time for them yet.
I think also in retrospect, the first two drafts are probably pretty bad. It's funny because people say, how do you become a good writer? Well, practice,
Yeah,
right?
Right.
Nobody's a great writer. The short story collection I did, for example, it spans my writings from when I was a kid to today. Now, the stories when I was a kid, I completely rewrote them because reading them back in retrospect, the stories were great. The writing was god-awful. And, I mean, I'm not too shy to say that I look at my early writing and think, wow,
Yeah.
it was really bad.
But there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's, I think, the mark of being a talented writer is being able to, first of all, say, hey, this was rough. This needed some work. And then, but it's because of how much you've improved your craft in the time.
Right.
Yeah.
And the ideas itself, those still come the same way. I mean, even as a kid, I've always had the idea. Most people say, well, where do you get your ideas? I get my ideas often enough from dreams. I had a really good one that actually, it's the first story in my short story collection and is the lead, it's the genesis of my latest novel that's not released yet. I remember in the dream itself, I was in this gothic manor and it almost seemed like I was watching a sepia-toned film. And I walk into this room, and there in the room, my brother's sitting in a chair by a window. I could see like light filtering through the window, and I could see like motes of dust in the light that was streaming through. And I walk in, and everything is silent. And he turns to me very slowly, as these things can only happen in a dream. And he looks at me and says, "They're coming." So I stop and I say, "Who is?" And he goes, "The ones who will eat our souls." Ooh. And from there I knew, oh my God, I have this phenomenal story, and everything just exploded, and it ended up becoming a novel.
Yeah. It's so funny you bring that up because literally last night I woke up in the middle of the night after having a dream and I was like, oh my God, this is my next book. And I tried to get to my phone to write it down. So
Yeah.
like, I'm never going to remember it. Fell asleep before I could write it down. And this morning I've got 25% of the details. You know what I mean?
But that's still 25%.
It's still 25%. It's something, right? So would you say that's how most of your ideas have come to you? I mean, obviously not all of them, but like in dreams, or is it just, I feel like I think a lot of writers would agree, it's almost like sometimes these ideas come from somewhere else.
Yes.
Right? So that's something you'd relate to?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, a lot of stories in my short story collection, for example, I travel a lot. I love to travel. One of them, I went to South Africa for work. And at the time, Ebola was running rampant north of the continent, like in Liberia. So I finished my work in South Africa. I was at the airport, and I started feeling a bit under the weather. I'm like a little scratchy in the throat, a little bit of a fever. And I noticed that they were checking people before they let them board. And my first thought was, oh my God, if they pull me out of this line and not let me board my flight, I might never get out of here. So on the flight back, I wrote a story about these two treasure hunters going to the heart of Africa to search for like a lost treasure and finding something far, far worse.
Ooh,
so
yeah.
it led to the genesis of a story. Another time, for example, I was actually in Helsinki for work. And one of my coworkers was, found out that I write horror and fantasy and whatnot. So he asked if I ever heard of the story of the murders at Lake Bottom, which was a series of famously unsolved murders. Created the genesis, and I came up with a short story, a really creepy little ghost story I called The Kids in Black and White. And so things just pop, and probably get into too much trouble with my imagination, but, if something pops to me, I'll write it down and I'll eventually write a story about it.
Yeah. That's where I think my best work has come from, right? Is from this mix of life experiences and maybe something that started off as a dream and then something that I almost feel like is just coming to me from who knows where. Do you ever, because you mentioned like this really creepy, based on a ghost story, do you ever like scare yourself when you're writing?
Far too much, actually. Yeah. And it's funny because I don't want to write a pure horror story. Yeah. Because maybe I'm jaded after, all these years, and I've yet to find a movie that really scares me to the core. But I love a movie that has creepy elements. So most of my writing now tends to not be horror, but have horror undercurrents.
I think that's the best way to do horror, is it has to be almost subtle. Yeah. I find that when there's that like the suspense aspect or even like the plot twist sort of horror, that's what's really chilling, right? So I agree with that. You have to have sort of a subtle element to it, or have it woven into like a greater story so that you actually really care about the characters, not just you're expecting them all to die from the get-go.
Right. And for example, like the first book that I ever wrote was a story called Dawn of Broken Glass.
You have great titles, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Well, Dawn of Broken Glass, the whole genesis was based upon something that happened during World War II, Kristallnacht, which was the night of broken glass. And this basically was a family that was attacked, brutalized, and left for dead, but they had a survivor. And the survivor who escaped plotted revenge upon the families of the soldiers who killed his family. So right off the bat, that's very dark to begin with. And then, of course, I interlaced it with, in Hebrew mythology, there's a creature called the golem. Mm-hmm. So, of course, I took a golem. I did all the research on it. I even describe on how to kind of build one and, bring it to life by, the naming of God down the arms, putting the word life on the forehead, and creating this unstoppable machine. Well, I, of course, ramped that up to 11 and really created a fun creature in the midst of a revenge story. Huh. I don't like to just do something that's simple. I like to bring in other factions and make things a lot more complicated.
Well, when you bring in those layers, it makes it so much more believable to the reader, where you're like, here's this historical element, here's this mythological element, and maybe you're expounding on it and adding more to it, right? But I think that's really important for writing. I love that concept, too, of where it's like a horror novel, but then you're almost rooting for, if they're getting revenge, right? Like, are
Yes.
they the protagonist or the antagonist here? Maybe a little bit of both.
And that was the whole point of my story, because the lead character was deeply flawed.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about it. His whole mission is to not only kill the soldiers, but their families
Oof.
and all their descendants, because they took away his whole family. He was
Yeah.
going to take all of theirs. And it's very hard to root for somebody who is doing that, and yet you make him almost as the anti-hero. And that's
Yeah.
a little bit of a twist in the story.
It takes a certain amount of time and talent to get that just right, for sure. I definitely think that's something that I like in my writing too, is I want flawed characters, because
Yes.
people are naturally flawed. Like, you want your writing to be realistic, even if it's some fantasy, high fantasy, right? Paranormal, where it's not these things we're experiencing everyday life. There's ways to make it so that it feels so real to your reader, and that takes time to develop.
Yes, and one of the things I like to talk about with that whole thing of making the believable characters, I like to do something I call my suspension of disbelief, because I want people to know that, yes, it's a fantastic story. There are things in there that really aren't real, but they could feel like they're drawn into the story. For example, Bloodlines, it's a basic premise. These two brothers are having these dreams, and in their dreams, this shadowy figure abducts their children. And they wake up and find their kids gone. So they team up, reunite with some old high school friends, and go on a journey that takes them into the afterlife and beyond. So it's really out there, but the characters were based upon myself and my brother. So this is my little secret, but every character in everything I write is based upon a real person. So the flaws are there, I try to have almost like the passions, the drives, the desires, so the person feels believable. And if the person feels real, and how they speak and how they interact with others, you're more likely to buy into the story.
I totally agree with that. And it comes down to even the most subtle things that you have to pay attention to in your writing. And that's like how each character's speech patterns differ, and mannerisms that you can fit in there. And I think what I hear from a lot of people is something you said earlier too, where like your first draft of something is terrible. It's always terrible. I finished a first draft last year, and you have that moment after where you're like, ooh, like but you have to come back and add in those layers and give it that life to make it into something that you're proud of. And that takes time.
And I guess we're really all our own worst critics.
Yeah.
Like the book, I finished a book. It's been edited and edited and edited. I've changed the title. It's now called The Ninth Plague. And it's an interesting story because it's a bio-thriller. And I actually have a background in the sciences, so I love doing something like this. But it's also dealing with folklore. For example, in the days of the Pharaoh, the folklore was that Moses visited plagues upon the Egyptians. Mm-hmm. So the ninth plague was the plague of darkness. Oh. So I'm weaving that as what happens if that wasn't just folklore, but was real.
Yeah.
As, sort of a bioterrorism into a real life story. So it becomes a thriller, but there's dark elements underneath.
Interesting. Is that based a historical setting, or is it based in present day?
It's, now this is where it gets interesting because I started writing this actually right around the 2016 election. So I wrapped politics into this, and this is where it gets a little murky, because then, of course, it shifted from one party to another party, and now it shifted back. So I'm going to do the old writer's trope when I clean up the final draft, and instead of saying like 2024, 2026, I'll just have like 20 and then the dash, because I want this to be sort of like an alternate reality in a sense from our reality. But the cool thing is, in every one of my stories, I have some interlocking components. So from Dawn of Broken Glass, there's a character who is in Bloodlines. Not who you would ever expect, and that's all I'm going to say in that, because I don't want to give it away. But there's also a character in this one here in The Ninth Plague, and I have another story that I'm taking a character from there, and I'm hoping to kind of create a series, because the lead character is, sort of an FBI agent who's drawn into this kind of case. Not quite X-Filey, but things that are a little bit off the beaten path.
What's your like your process for writing? Do you outline a lot, or you just kind of get it on the page? What's the usual process?
That's an interesting comment and question, because I used to try to do it by creating an outline, because everybody says, oh, you have to like break it down. Like, what are you going to do in each paragraph? And eventually I'm like, you know what, screw that.
Yeah.
I know where I want to start. It's all up here in my head. So I know I'm going to start at A and I'm going to get to Z. How I get there, it's not linear. But the one thing I do like to do is I like to write kind of in a cinematic mindset. So I want to make it very visual, so you feel like you're actually there. Because I had a lot of people have said to me, wow, I could really see this as a movie. And that's my whole intent. I want you to feel like you're reading a movie.
Yeah.
So every every chapter is essentially ends on a little mini cliffhanger. And I've actually had people tell me that they really hate me for that, because, they don't want to put it down. I used to do a lot of shows where I would sell books. I used to go to a lot of comic book shows, because those used to sell, but they've gotten slower and it's not worth the time anymore. But
Yeah.
I've had people come up to me and say, I bought your book, loved it, couldn't put it down. And, if you think about it, if you got 3 intertwined threads, so chapter 1, it doesn't continue usually until chapter 4. So you're reading 2 and 3, but each time you're reading, it leaves you like wanting more. So you want to just keep turning the pages.
Yeah. Does most of your writing, do you have like one character that it's always from their perspective? Do you do multiple perspectives of characters?
Try to do third person. I've been told by a lot of other writers, don't do first person, it's not good. But you know what? I disagree. I don't want to do first person simply because I have too many characters that are often intertwined and that their fates get intermingled per se. So it'd be very complicated if I just did I as opposed to the man or so-and-so.
I think it all comes down to the story. My book that I wrote, my published one, it's in first person. My new project that's almost done is in third person, right?
Right.
And it's based on the stories. The first one, it needed to be in first person, I think, to tell it correctly. So I think that approach of the story in a way almost writes itself.
It does.
I don't know if you ever have those moments, I'm sure you do, where you might go back and read what you've written and it's almost like, I don't remember writing this. I don't know if it was me. You know what I mean? And it's like it wrote itself in the way that it was meant to be, which I don't know if that sounds a little over the top. I mean, it's just a story at the end of the day, but I think anyone who is a writer listening can relate to that.
Oh, I think so. And I mean, I've had times where I've read something I've written, 1 page, 2 pages, 10 pages. I've read through and like, oh my God, this is perfect.
Yeah.
Other times I've read through and it's like, yeah, I'm not keeping any of this. But you have to write how it flows onto the page, whether it's by hand, whether it's on your keyboard. The story writes itself, in my opinion. And if it's meant to be first person and it's better for it, absolutely. If it's meant to be third person, even better. If it's meant to be multiple first person perspectives, but it has to fit the story.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Do you read a lot too, or mostly just write? Or
I read. I haven't read a lot of horror lately.
Okay.
I found that it's getting a bit redundant, and hence the reason I'm trying not to write pure horror.
Yeah.
I do like good authors, though. I mean, I'll read, for example, Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. They just popped into my head. And they write sort of high adventure stories, but with dark undercurrents. Or, for example, someone like F. Paul Wilson, who had a character that he wrote probably 20-odd books called Repairman Jack, who is your average normal guy who basically got drawn into situations and he became a fixer. But the fixer often segued into a little bit of dark fantasy or horror.
Yeah.
Which to me made a lot more fascinating stories.
Yeah, definitely. I think reading is such an important way to like hone the craft, right? Like obviously you have to write, but you have to read too. I think the tricky thing with it, I personally struggle to read in the same genre that I'm currently writing in. Like,
agreed.
Right now I'm writing a fantasy book. I'm having a hard time reading anything that's fantasy right now. I don't know what it is. Is it it's like you almost get in your own head with it. Or maybe it's just too much of a good thing.
Yeah, see, I think for myself, part of the problem is I'd worry that their ideas would influence me because fantasy itself, and fantasy is extremely broad. I mean, when I was growing up, my friends who read fantasy, everyone was like, Lord of the Rings, Lord of the
Yep.
Rings.
The OG, that's
Yeah.
the original.
But you know what I enjoyed a lot more?
What?
Was, I don't know if you've ever heard of the author Michael Moorcock.
I don't think so.
You have to read him. So he actually is extremely versatile. He wrote a series of books with this character called Elric, who was an albino who had this black sword called Stormbringer that basically fed off of people's souls.
Oh.
But my favorite books from him were the books of Corum. So Corum was kind of an elf-like character, but they're bigger, and they were wiped out by humankind, man, basically.
Yep.
And his story took him into alternate planes. And this is well before Marvel did their multiverse and whatnot. And his stories are wild, like beyond belief wild. And I thought they were so much more different than, like the Lord of the Rings. And don't get me wrong, I love the Lord of the Rings. I've read the books, I've read the movies, et cetera, et cetera. But something that will just blow me away by being so completely different.
Yeah.
I love that stuff.
The thing I'd say I am almost jealous with Tolkien about is he started that genre,
Pretty much.
right? So, and it's in a way he had just all this room to do whatever with, and I feel like today, especially when you get to like just outside of next step from writing, the publishing industry, they expect you to kind of do certain things, and it's tricky to follow that. I want to write for myself. Your best writing is going to be, I think, when you're writing something that you would want to read.
Correct.
But always in the back of my head, and I don't know if you'd relate to this, I'm thinking, yes, but are other people going to like this? Because I want to get it published and I want it to be successful, but I don't know if that's always the best way to look at it.
Yeah, so I know if you're writing for yourself, you got to write what you love.
Yeah.
And if what you love is not being a carbon clone of J.R.R. Tolkien,
Yeah.
so be it. But I think readers itself appreciate a good story. I know a lot of people will be like, ooh, well, this is like Lord of the Rings. I got to pick it up. But eventually it gets boring, right? Yes. Oh, wow, you're going on a quest. I mean, Lord of the Rings basically created Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons really brought in fantasy.
Yep.
But there's just so much you can do. Like, I'm going on a quest. I'm going to have a party. We're going to have all these different characters within a party.
Standard hero's journey
Yes.
sort of thing. Yep.
And at some point, you'll be like, there's got to be something more. It was like that a lot with science fiction as well. And I remember as a kid, one of the authors of science fiction I used to like to read was Robert A. Heinlein, because science fiction prior to him was a little more hard sci-fi.
Yeah.
Very technical, a lot of mathematics. And Heinlein took it and made it fun. You don't necessarily need to know the propulsion on your spaceship or, what's your pressure in your spacesuit to enjoy a story. Like, one of my favorite sci-fi stories was Alien.
Yep. Oh, classic.
I mean, it was a haunted house with a monster in space.
Yep.
I mean, what more could you ask for?
That's something I love about sci-fi. I'm like sci-fi fantasy. My first book's post-apocalyptic. Like that's what I love. And I feel like sci-fi almost even more than like the fantasy genre. There's so much you can do with it. Like you just said, it's such a versatile genre.
And it's funny because sci-fi lends to horror very nicely.
Yes, beautifully. Like Alien, exactly.
Yes.
Your story. So you do horror and then like a dark fantasy element. Have you written much that brings in other genres like sci-fi, or is it on like?
I haven't really. I don't want to write something that I wouldn't be proud of. And, I'm never going to write, some of these sci-fi stories that you read. I do have great ideas. And it's funny because, I was friends with another author who passed away a few years ago, and he was a sci-fi writer. And he liked to put in the elements of horror into his sci-fi. So after he passed, his wife gave me some unfinished work he has. He has
nice.
something that he was working on, a script. And I looked at it, and I've been struggling to try to make that work as a writer because it's so different. But then he took something that was a little darker and a little less hard sci-fi, where he has a character who's almost investigating things that are a little more satanic.
Ooh.
And I was like, yeah, I could work with that. He only has 20 pages or 30 pages written, but the ideas have been percolating already, and I could see a way how I could take that, wrap a story around it, and make something fun out of it.
Yeah. No, and what a great way to like pay homage to your friend too, is to like take this idea and finish it for him, right?
I know, and I feel bad because I really should spend more time writing, and sometimes life gets in the way.
Yeah, life gets in the way, and I think you have to be in the proper creative mindset.
I'm always there.
Yeah, but it's like I'm sure you've had times where it's like, oh my God, I have all these ideas right now. I feel so creative. I feel great. Then you go to sit down and you just stare at the keyboard.
I know this sounds weird. That never happens.
Really?
I always can write. That doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I always can write. If someone says, write a story about blank, I'll sit down and churn it out. Sometimes I'll look at it after and go, yeah, nobody's ever seeing this.
Yeah.
I mean, a great example, we were on vacation with a bunch of friends, and this really strange old guy just kept following us around. And so one of the guys we were traveling with referred to him, oh, there goes Grandpa Teeth. And somehow that just stuck in my head again.
Yeah.
So I wrote a story called Grandpa Teeth, and it was actually really good. But sometimes I'll see something and I'll start writing, and I'll look and say, I can't even submit this. And they say, it's not worth it.
How many drafts do you typically go through with a story? And I know that's kind of a broad question because it obviously is going to depend. But
yeah. For a novel,
yeah,
I could read it through and say, wow, it's great, and then sit down 2 weeks later, read it through again, and got a third of it. I think it really has to do with my mindset at the time. What I'm trying to do, and this is something that another trick that I like to do, is I try to read it out loud. Because when I'm reading quietly, it seems and sounds a lot better. If I read it out loud, I'm thinking, this is clunky, or
yep.
My God, people don't speak like that. I mean, because dialogue is very important to me. And as you mentioned, people are all flawed and people are all different. And my characters are based in real life. So
yeah.
They speak differently. They have different vernacular. They have different choice of words. Some speak a little more harshly. Others, have a lot of profanity in how they speak. But they're different characters. So that when I'm reading it out loud, and let's just say you have a cop and he's sitting there, and he sounds like an English poet, I'm thinking, okay, I probably should change this.
Yeah, reading it out loud, that's a really good point. I've done the same thing, and it just puts it in a completely different perspective.
Yeah, and I've done a couple of readings, and this is really the litmus test for me. If I could read through a page out loud and I'm like, oh yeah.
Yep.
Then I know I've got it.
Yep.
But if I read through a page and I'm thinking, and I just want to shake my head, it means I didn't write it well.
What's do you have like a typical word, like length, word count in your novels that you're aiming for? Are they more like novella length, or what's that been look like for you?
I like to target 100,000 words. I know that sounds weird, but because you could do a novel that's, 70,000 or so, or 70,
yeah,
75?
Think around 70 is generally where it's considered a novel. Anything less than that would be more like novella,
yeah.
I believe.
I don't want to do novellas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I could ramble on plenty to fill up a story, but I think that there's enough, because I don't just do a very linear story. I like to incorporate a lot of things. Like, for example, Stephen King doesn't believe in a short book, right?
Yeah.
And I love Stephen King stuff. I've read him my whole life, but my God, he rambles.
Yeah.
And, he'll start talking about a dog, and then the dog's owner, and then the dog's owner's cousin, and the dog's owner's cousin's friend. And eventually it's like, dude, stop.
Yeah.
Because it gets boring. I mean, I want to get to the meat and the potatoes of the story, but I like to be descriptive. I like, as I mentioned earlier, when I had the dream and I walked into that, sepia-tinged room, and I'm seeing the light coming through the window, mm-hmm. and what I saw on the lawn, for example, once he said that they're here. But that kind of thing, to me, I want to get that on paper. So when the person's reading, they want to keep reading. And if it gets boring, they stop.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. There's so many people out there that say they want to write a book. Everybody says they want to write a book. It's like 5% actually do, or something like that, maybe even less.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, 100,000 words is a huge accomplishment. That's a lot. It takes a significant time commitment to do it. But I've personally found that maybe the first 20,000 words are easy, can do that in a heartbeat. The next 30,000 are a slog, right? And then after that, can just keep going. And you almost, when you're passionate about it and you're writing the story that's meant to be written, you can clear that 100,000 mark almost too easily. My current project I'm at, first draft was like 150,000.
Oh, wow.
I would like to get that down to like 115, 120. And this is a sci-fi fantasy, so it can be longer, but it's like, oh, exactly what you said. Now I'm reading through it and I'm like, did I really need to have this whole paragraph description of their lunch?
Well, Tolkien used to do that a lot.
Yeah.
And that's why Tolkien's books were so big. You don't need to sit there and describe every single tree you see.
Yeah.
This tree is there. It is unclean. Okay, great. And then he walks on. So it doesn't have anything in the story. To me, if I had a book that was probably 150, 160, I'd start wondering, do I want to make it as 2 books? Which might make sense. But if you start going through and you're doing your editing process and all of a sudden it's hack and slash, well, maybe you do get down to the $120.
Exactly. With Tolkien too, I think his books, they'll often be parts of them where generally in today's writing, right, everything that you're putting into your story, even if it's those extra details, it's intended to move the story along,
yes.
Right? Everything you're putting in there has a reason. And I think that, weirdly enough, in a lot of Tolkien books, there's things in there that are just in there for fun. Like they don't actually move the story. It's not like moving from point A to B to C. And it's not to say there's anything wrong with that, because I love him as an author too, right? But I just think it's an interesting way to look at how it was writing in his time and how it is today. And I think a lot of that's due to like a commercial aspect almost.
I think you're right. And don't forget the other thing that's very important. People have very limited attention spans these days.
Yep.
I mean, everybody is hooked on their phone, and, your LOLs and all this other stuff that you're texting back and forth, and, all the abbreviations and acronyms and whatnot. People don't read as much. And, I know it sounds weird, but I would say probably 75% of my readership are women. And I don't know, maybe it's just guys don't like to read as much, but I've done shows, mostly women come up and talk to me. They're the ones who are buying my books. They're the ones who are like, wow, I really like this.
Yeah.
Where their boyfriends are usually standing there like, come on, I'm bored.
I actually think I've heard similar statistics recently that more readers and more writers recently are women. That's interesting, the short attention span thing though. So in what I do in real estate, a lot of us will do like YouTube videos and stuff. And some of the advice that I've gotten through research is when you're doing like a YouTube video, for instance, your scene needs to change every 7 seconds to keep people engaged. And if you go on YouTube and you look up popular videos from popular YouTubers, you can count 7 seconds. It never goes more before the screen is like changing the angle, changing the subject, whatever it is. So I totally agree with you that it's almost an attention span issue, and that's leaking into the publishing world.
Well, I think we've changed it, almost as a people. Think of it this way. Your parents, your grandparents, they used to watch television. They'd have like 2 or 3 channels. They'd watch the same channel all night long, whatever the programming was. Nowadays, with hundreds of channels, first of all, kids don't watch TV anymore anyways.
Yeah.
But people are channel surfing. If they're watching online, they're going to one streaming service to another. How many times have you started a movie, let's say on Netflix, you watch 5 minutes, don't like it, turn it off.
Yeah.
Or you pick up a book that you download for $1 and you start reading 10 pages, don't like it, and you put it down. People don't want to give anything a chance anymore. It's funny. I mean, when I was a kid, I wrote a lot for me, but I also write for the audience that I do have. And like in my latest book, The Ninth Plague, I have 2 lead characters, and they're both women, because I want people who are reading my books to feel like they're more invested in the characters.
Yeah. Something that I try to keep in mind, to like you said, not just right for me is
Right.
so my I have like friends and family who when I finish a project I want them to read it, right? They're my beta readers. I'm sure you have like similar
Yes.
like, hey, you're a trusted person, you're a safe person, read this and tell me if it's garbage. So I try to factor in like, are they going to enjoy this? Because then it's kind of taking that next step where it's like, I'm writing just for me. Now I'm writing for people that I know really well. Are they going to like it? And if they're going to like it, then chances are a wider audience is going to like it too. So I feel like that's a nice like middle ground sort of there.
Especially if they're honest.
Yes.
I know my brother's always like, let me be a beta reader. Because he does like to read.
Yep.
And I guess, we got it from our folks. I mean, my mom taught English and creative writing, for example,
Yeah.
and journalism. But we like to read, my brother and I. And I know if I send him a draft, he'll tell me, he goes, oh my God, I loved it, versus,
Yeah. Yep. And I've had to have conversations with my beta readers like, listen, be honest with me.
yes.
Don't be mean, but and not that I think they would be, but be honest with me. I want you to tell me what you thought of it. After my dad read my first book, he gave me his like review quote. And it was, I thought it was excellent. I'm so glad that it's good. I was really scared I'd have to tell you that it was terrible. And he's like, and I would have.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, that's good. That's what I want, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, if something doesn't work, I want someone to tell me that. Because if it's not working for one person, it probably is not working for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I want the story to flow. I want it to have cohesiveness. I want the characters. They don't have to be likable. I had a character I wrote in my first book, Donna Broken Glass, based upon a former employer. Mm-hmm. And the guy was such a pompous ass. And I changed his name a little bit. He'll never know it was based on him. But I made the character so inherently unlikable that you were actually cheering for bad things to happen to him. But that's just like my little thing. I like to throw little Easter eggs into the stories
Me too.
and make it kind of fun for the reader.
I love having Easter eggs in my stories. And even if it's just really subtle or bigger ones or you get so like emotionally attached to your work, especially when
Well,
you've
yeah.
spent so much time and it's such an emotional and creative effort to create it that you want to have those little things in there, right? Like I'll in my first novel, there's a cat, like just a random cat that comes in, but I describe it as it's one of my cats. Like that's how one of my cats that I actually have looks like, and it's just a one-off thing. But it's like that's my little love letter in my writing to the people in my family around me, and it just I feel like it enriches your work, and it's just part of it.
It does. And to be honest, it makes it more personal for you. For example, in my story, Bloodlines, there was a scene with my wife and our old dog. That was probably one of the creepiest scenes I've ever written. And I just had to throw it in there. Sometimes, when an idea pops in, and it wasn't in the original story, but I'm like, oh my God, it fit. But like little Easter eggs, as you mentioned. So in Bloodlines, I have two of my old high school friends that I brought into the book. I basically put it out there, like, who wants to be in my book? And they were the first, I do. So one of my friends I've known since I was, 6 years old. Mm-hmm. And not that long before before I wrote the book, he was driving and he had a series of mini strokes, like little transischemic attacks. And he kind of lost consciousness. He veered off the road. He survived. His wife was in the car. Everybody was okay. But it left him with Swiss cheese memory, kind of like Scott Bakula in Quantum Leap.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of things he didn't remember. Huh. So when I took him into the book, I incorporated that Swiss cheese memory, and it became an integral part of the plot line.
Interesting.
My other character, who I've also known since junior high, his brother died at a very young age, tragically. He had a lot of bad things just happen to him in life, and my friend found him dead in his chair. He had taken too many meds because he was hurting. I incorporated that in the story, and it became a really, really scary scene.
Yeah.
And both of them, they loved how their families, their lives were portrayed in the stories.
Yeah. Writing it's when it's like this innate thing that you have to do and you're so passionate about, it's often really like cathartic.
Yes.
You know, I wrote my first novel. I started writing it shortly after my mom passed away from cancer. And there's some subplot lines in there. There's other characters that I wrote in there that had cancer. And just the whole process of writing it was therapy. Like, it was better than any therapy that I think I could have gone out and gotten. And I think at the end of the day, it made the writing more rich and more real.
Oh, absolutely. And here's the best part about it all. It immortalizes the people that you put forth on the page.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I think that's such an important aspect of it too. And it's, even if the 99% of your readers of it will never know or won't pick up on this interwoven sort of, process to it or background to it, it's like you just said, they're immortalized in your writing now.
Exactly.
I love that.
And the 99%, all they'll get is, wow, this is a rich tapestry.
Yeah, they'll be like, oh, this is a great book.
Right. The book feels good, the story's fleshed out, but those close to you, the family, the close friends, they'll feel that because they'll know the person and they'll understand who it's all about.
Yeah. Do you do dedications in your books?
Oh, absolutely.
Ooh, yeah.
I always
This
do.
one.
For example, like in this one here, so I dedicated it to my wife and daughter, whose light keeps me off the dark path, because the short story collection was Down the Dark Path.
That's a solid dedication.
Not only do I do dedications, but I also like epigrams too, because sometimes you find something in there that, I don't know if I put an epigram into my short story collection, but what I do like to do is bring something in there that makes it, actually yes, and this one I did. So in the short story collection, I said, man is fully responsible for his nature and his choices by Sartre. Because at the end of the day, this whole story, this whole collection, Down the Dark Path, deals with choices.
Yeah.
So I try to have something that's a little poignant, a little thought-provoking, that makes you think before I really take you down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. I love when those are included in books, as long as they're included well.
And for the right reasons.
Yes, and for the right reasons, and not just because, I want to put more in here. But I love that.
Well, it has to make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And that's bringing all of these different pieces together to making something that's cohesive and well thought out.
Right. And I mean, I don't put in an epigram, for example, to appear a little bougie or well read or
there's plenty of people that do those.
They do. But look, I mean, I'm writing stories that, think of back in the day, Steven Spielberg had his amazing stories, right?
Yep.
They were dealing with fantasy, horror, sci-fi, whatever. That's what I like to write. I mean, and that's what it sounds like you're writing. We're writing amazing stories. We're writing stuff that is outside the scope of what's normal or what's real.
Yeah.
But gives a fun story so people can enjoy it.
Yeah. No, I love that, putting it in that framework. I don't know about you. I give a lot of like leeway to other authors. So you mentioned earlier, like, you can download a book for $1, right?
Yeah.
That's like my fatal flaw. I don't have a Kindle. I buy all of my books. I love hardcovers. So I go spend a lot of money on books, and sometimes I can't finish it, don't love it, whatever. But I just have, I understand how much effort it goes into writing it, right? Yeah. So even if I'm like, God, I really didn't like this, I didn't think it was well written, it's like, but so much effort went into this that it's still, like, I can never give a book a 1 star. You know what I mean? Just for that,
I wouldn't.
That reason.
I mean, if I truly hated a story, I wouldn't leave a review.
No, I wouldn't leave a review. I don't recommend it to anyone, and I didn't finish it, and
right.
That's it.
A writer puts a lot of their heart and soul into their work.
Yeah.
And I know this is terrible, but there are writers out there who actually like to slam other writers. Maybe they think it makes them appear better, but
yeah.
Look, it's a small community. As you said, 5% of people write books. And there was a point where everybody was writing zombie stories.
Yeah.
And
I love a good zombie story.
Oh, so do I. My God. And like the remake, for example, of, what was it? Dawn of the Dead.
Yep.
That was, to me, one of the most amazing zombie stories I've ever seen. So a good zombie book, it's gold. And I still remember I downloaded one. It was, I guess, self-pubbed. Mm-hmm. It was just so bad, though. And I kept trying to read it because I really know that people try, but it was awful. And,
yeah.
I'm not going to sit there and slam another author, but I don't think I'd probably ever buy anything of theirs again.
That still, they probably put a lot of work into it. And it's like, we all started from somewhere.
Yes.
My first book, I'm very proud of it. I think it's good. I think it's really quite good. But there's definitely things that I know it could have done better and that I am doing better on the next one. Like, it's a journey for everybody.
But here's the thing that people seem to forget.
Mm-hmm.
We're so used to, the Stephen Kings of the world, for example, or the James Pattersons, or like the well-known big published authors in these giant New York publishing houses. The reality is they write a book and they have like 10 editors like sanitizing the heck out of it.
Yeah.
Most people who self-pub or do small press do not.
Yep, very
so
true.
The book tends to be a little more raw, a little more true to the core. I guarantee if you take a script that Stephen King, who's done like writing for 40 years, what he gave to his publisher versus the finished product are night and day.
If I look back at, all the books I've read over the course of my life, a lot of the ones that I really thought were special were from lesser known authors, or were self-published, or just random ones that I picked up. So I think, and that's another issue with the publishing industry. I don't want to say issue, but way that it's kind of gone is I feel like it's just becoming a little bit of a narrow funnel where it's so hard to get picked up, and then you got to fit in these boxes.
I agree. And, I will say that some of the best books I've read have been by small press or self-pubbed.
Yeah.
A great story that happened to me when I was doing shows. This guy came up to me, who I used to see at all these shows. He was an interesting character. He always had this, like almost like a zombie puppet on his arm kind of thing. It was a lot of people do cosplay at these shows.
Okay. I was like, just out and about, casually interesting.
But the cosplay folks don't typically buy. They're there to show off their costumes.
Yeah.
So he came up to me and he goes, dude, I bought Dawn of Broken Glass at the last show. He goes, I loved it. He goes, what else do you have? I will buy anything you have.
Oh my God.
So I had 2 other books and a short story collection, an anthology that I was part of. He bought all 3.
Yeah.
He didn't care. He just said, and I've had a lot of people tell me that. I mean, I've never had anybody at a show say they didn't like it. I had someone email me. They said, oh, I didn't like Dawn of Broken Glass. I thought it was derived. And my first thought is, really? Mm-hmm. Revenge against the Nazis and their families using a golem is derived? Okay.
To each their own. You're allowed to have your own opinions.
Right. But I found that most people have come to me and they said, I really like it. And that makes me want to write even more.
Yeah. It's hard for sure to like get that thick skin, especially when you start off. I mean, I had an instance where I had one person just absolutely roast it, hated it, whatever. I was like, God, it hurts, but we're going to move past it. They have their own opinion. But you learn from it, and you learn to develop, not everything's going to be everyone's cup of tea.
Right.
And then you think, like, say, take Harry Potter, right? The most famous series ever, essentially. She was rejected by tons of publishing houses. And today there'll be people who say, oh my God, I hate it. I think they're terrible, right? But so many people love it. It's just, and you can say that with everything. Lord of the Rings, Stephen King. It's just not going to be everyone's cup of tea.
Oh, I agree. And, it's funny. I got a review from one of my books. Actually, it was the first one. And they said, it was okay. I didn't like the fact that the character was so flawed.
Yeah.
And my thought was, that was the whole purpose.
I had a similar review with my first book, actually. And I didn't mind this review. This didn't bother. It was like a 3-star review, I think.
Yeah.
And it was, I thought it was fine, right? But I had a hard time rooting for the main character. She's got a lot of issues. And I'm like, well, I get that, right?
Who
But that's
doesn't?
the point. Like, that's literally the point of this character, And that kind of review, that doesn't bother me at all. I'm like, it's constructive criticism,
Agreed. When I write a character, I don't want to have, that stereotypical lantern-jawed, cleft chin.
Yeah, the Mary Sue. They're called like Mary Sues, right? Where they're just perfect.
I don't want that.
Yeah.
I want somebody who's going to have a weakness, somebody who's going to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, piss somebody off, make a bad choice, because that's what people do.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important too. You bring that into your side characters, right? And you
Yeah.
have, and you can still have someone who's the hero, who's just a fantastic person, a fantastic character, but they're still going to have some kind of flaw. It doesn't have to be huge, but there's something there, and that's bringing that life to your writing. And not everyone's going to like it, and not everyone's going to understand it, but that's
Well,
okay.
I try to bring life to my side characters too.
Yeah.
You ever play video games?
Oh yeah, I'm
Okay.
a big video game
So you
person.
know, in a video game, there's always NPCs.
Yes.
Well, I don't want NPCs in my story.
Yeah.
My NPCs have names.
Yep.
They have ambitions, whatever else that motivates a human being. So, yeah, they might not have a role in the book other than being a short part of it, but
Yeah.
I try to take them out of the NPC functionality.
Yeah. How do like names come to you? And so most of the time I just start writing the character and I'm like, that's their name. Like I know that's meant to be their name. I don't ever change it. But then every once in a while I'm like scrolling through like a list of names for inspiration or something. I don't know. This is just always something that sticks out to me with my writing. How's that work for you?
Ooh, that's a really good question. See, what I usually try to do is my characters are all based on real people, as I mentioned.
Yep.
So let's say, for example, I'll take like the first name. If the guy's name is Dan, maybe I'll change it to Dave. maybe I'll keep it at Dan.
Yep.
If their last name is, let's say, Ferguson, maybe I'll change it to Faring or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's still that
Yeah.
essential closeness,
Yeah.
but it's not the same. It's weird when you think about it because we grow into our names. I know this is a weird thing, but if I was named, for example, instead of Gordon, let's say I was named Graham, I might be a very different person.
Yeah.
Because and I know my mom said that she actually considered naming me Graham, and I'm like, thanks for not, because I don't see myself as a Graham.
Yeah.
But to me, I see it like a Graham as somebody almost in a tweed coat with, those, elbow patches, teaching at a college.
Yep. I picture it exactly as you described.
Right. Almost having, that professor's beard with, like the pipe. And I just don't see that.
Yeah.
And so we grow into our names. And that's why when I take a character based on a real person, they've already grown into their character and they're already defined, at least the essence of the character. So the name has to kind of flow from who they are.
Yeah. That's a good point. I don't think you don't meet many people where you're like, oh, your name doesn't fit you at all.
Not a lot.
Not
no.
often. Not often. Interesting. Yeah, it translates perfectly onto the page then.
Well, and you could thank or blame your parents as
Yeah.
best as you see fit, right?
With your characters, do you make a lot of notes about them? Like, so I'll, with my main characters, I'll have little notes about them. I might even say, I like zodiac stuff. So I'll be like, this is what their zodiac sign is. And it's for a frame of reference, right?
Yeah.
Because it's hard when you're writing something that's so long to just really understand your main character, and then let alone you need to understand the motivations and the personality of all these other characters. So do you do like a note aspect or anything to help with that?
I do to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
Like if my main characters are based upon somebody I know,
Yep.
for example, my brother,
Yep.
I don't really need to define that because,
Yeah.
I've known him my whole life and I know how he thinks. I know what he likes, what he doesn't like. I know how to push his buttons.
Yep.
So this is a character that's already fleshed out in my head. But if it's somebody that I might know more peripherally, I'll take notes. What do I think that the person's motivations are? Mm. So I do try to give somebody how they would function based upon the character, right? And I will make notes on that. Mm-hmm. But I've not always kept to it. But if I have a lot of characters, and sometimes I do, I just need to sort of have a sense of, okay, what makes this person this person?
Yeah.
Because I've read some authors, for example, and again, I will not say names because, and thankfully, there's so many authors out there. You'd never know from this conversation who it is, but every single character sounds the same.
Yeah.
And you can't write like that. I mean, if you have one voice, you lose your reader.
there's in that vein, and I'm not going to name the book either, but I'm on TikTok, and TikTok has like a sub community called Book Talk, right? Where it's
Oh,
like, here's, all these books that are viral on TikTok that people love. And there's this one that everyone's like, oh my God, it's literally life changing. It's the best thing I've ever read. I couldn't finish it. I thought it was entertaining. I'm like, I don't understand. I couldn't finish it. And it had that exact issue where, other than like two characters, they were all just the same. It's the same character with a different name.
yeah.
And I again, that goes back to not everything's going to be everyone's cup of tea. But I think that is so important. Your characters are what make up your story, and
Agreed.
they need to be their own people.
And I think, to me, that's a big weakness in some of the writing because, look, I get it if you have 50 characters running loose in your story and interweaving and whatnot.
Yep.
It's going to be tricky to make 50 voices.
Yeah, some of them are going to be a little bland. That's okay.
But if you have 4 or 5, you can make 4 or 5 people have their own personalities.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have 2 people that are very much alike, but they're still not. Unfortunately, people are people. And even the people who are most in sync in life are still different. And you just have to put it down. And maybe if you're making the notes, like, oh, this guy likes chocolate. Oh, this guy watches sports. Oh, this guy listens to heavy metal. I mean, you just have something that almost defines them, and it comes out in how they speak to people, the way they speak to people. And your dialogue itself can do wonders for defining a character.
The thing that I often struggle with in that vein is, and I have to push myself on it, is having characters make decisions that are wildly different to the decision I would have made. And that's easy if it's a villain or something, right?
Yeah.
But if it's one of your main characters who at the end of the day is supposed to be the hero or the good guy or whatever, it's hard to just have them even little decisions, right? Like even they learn a tidbit of information, and I personally would be like, I'm going to go deal with this right now, because I don't hold off on dealing with things. But I'm like, no, this character is going to sit on it and let it get worse, and it's you have to like learn how to do that.
But the funny thing is, and that's you, right?
Yeah.
But that not everybody thinks like you.
Yeah.
I mean, there might be something, for example, that you'll say, hey, I have to do this. This makes a lot of sense, and it's very important that you take care of it. Somebody else might be, I could wait till tomorrow. And somebody else might be, someone else will do it.
Yeah.
And to me, it all comes down to motivation. And your characters are driven by motivation. A great example. Do you ever see like any of these Marvel movies that have, like, especially like the Avengers?
Yeah.
Right? So you have a big team of disparate, diverse individuals. What motivates them to act in unison, functioning for the same goal?
Yeah.
To me, it's a crock. You get 5 people together in a room, and more often than not, you're going to have them fighting over which direction to take, because everybody has an opinion, and it doesn't necessarily align. So that's why like superhero comic books and movies and whatnot are not real, because I mean, you look at this, then you come up with these teams of villains, right?
Yeah.
And they all seem to want the same thing. I don't buy it.
Yeah.
That's why your people have to be different.
Yeah. I think getting the motivation on a villain is often the hardest thing, because you have these, it's okay, this is the evil person because they're greedy, right? Or because they're a psychopath, right? But then you also can fall into this person's just evil for the sake of being evil, right?
Right.
And often that's not necessarily that compelling villain, because people like that generally aren't like that in real life. They have an underlying motive of some kind. And I feel like that with villains is really hard to get right.
Yeah, and again, that's why I love writing villains, because to me, the villains are the richest characters.
Yeah.
I mean, look at real life when you talk about people that are just inherently evil. Take a serial killer. What motivates them? There might be something that happened in their past that drives them to kill.
Exactly.
Sometimes people just have something broken that they're just working through. I think everybody has their own rationale. Like you said, it could be greed. Maybe they just need money. Maybe somebody, had an affair with their wife. I mean, you just don't know what triggers somebody to be a bad person. But if you make them as like a 3-dimensional character, the story is great, because you want to hate the villain in your story, but you
Yeah.
want to make him fascinating, right? I mean, your villains sometimes are a lot more fun than the heroes.
Yeah, exactly. It's having one that you like love to hate
Yeah.
is often so even if at the end they die or whatever and it's satisfying because you're like we had this build up and it was this three-dimensional person and it wasn't just like placeholder Dr. Evil guy, you know?
Well, they actually fleshed out Dr. Evil, if you think about it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They had him as Austin Powers' brother.
Yep.
So there was a lot of the backstory. But you're right. I mean, not everybody's going to be sitting around a conference table listening to some madman and they've all got, yes, this is exactly what I want.
Yeah.
First of all, where do you find all these people that have the same, like, yes, let's go after the British secret agent? I mean, it's ludicrous.
You're like, just go to the evil minion recruiter and be like, I need 6 guys for my conference room.
Exactly. LinkedIn evil.
Yep. I mean, that could be a concept. Maybe like a comedy.
It probably could. I mean, I'm sure somebody's probably already thought of that.
Yeah,
but
it might work better as a show than a book in that situation.
yeah, well, then again, also with shorter attention spans, people love binge watching TV shows.
True. Very true. I like it. I think it would be a good concept. All right. We have already been here for over an hour.
Oh, wow.
I want to hear, what do you have to promote? I know you mentioned some projects that you're working on right now. Is there anything coming out soon? Do you have a website you want to share?
You know, I took my website down. I'm going to reinvest in that once I get my new book out.
Okay.
So the ones that are currently out and available would be Dawn of Broken Glass, which is my debut, and it's gotten a lot of really good reviews. I've had people at shows come up to me and tell me how much they loved it.
Awesome.
The second novel was Bloodlines, which is a little more personal. It's the dark fantasy, deals a lot with Egyptian mythology, where your soul is weighed against the feather to determine your afterlife. So it's a wild story that, as I mentioned, these two brothers go on a journey to the afterlife. They come face to face with Anubis, and again, it ties into that initial story that I told you about, where the guy walks into the house and he sees his brother, about those who are going to eat their souls.
Yeah.
Because that whole house is an allegory for the afterlife. And that's where that whole Genesis came out years later. My short story collection, which is Down the Dark Path, which is all about choices one makes in life. And not all of them turn out so nice as you could possibly imagine. The project that is written, and I've edited the book like 3 times, so it's close, is The Ninth Plague.
Okay.
And that's the bioterrorism one with the female FBI agent.
That sounds in the vein of sci-fi.
It's, sci-fi, fantasy, thriller. I mean, but there's some darker stuff in there, just because it wouldn't be me, I think, if it wasn't. And from there, I think I have some projects I'm working on, but I really need to flesh it out. I've done in the past where I've worked on multiple things at once, and what ends up happening, nothing gets done.
Yep. Relatable.
So, got to go tunnel focus and finish editing the book. You know, as you can see, I mean, obviously you can't on a podcast, but I love a good cover.
Yeah.
And my books all have very expressive covers. I know that it's an interesting thing, but I try to make the cover very representative of the story. But when people see the book and they see the cover, they're like, oh my God, I have to have this. And I want to get that sense of excitement in people. And, you know, I've worked with a local artist. I'm going to try to something a little different for The Ninth Plague, because, you know, I'm trying to broaden out of purely, you know, in the horror niche to something that's really more of a thriller, because I really feel this one it's a thriller, a bio-thriller wrapped around an election.
Yeah.
So it makes it
really
kind of a wild story.
I like it. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
It really was.
Yeah. I think we had a good conversation. I'm excited to dig into that book that you've brought. Yeah.
And they're all available on Amazon.
Yep. Perfect. So that's the best place that people should get them, is Amazon, and they can just look up Gordon Anthony Bean, author.
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome.
I'm there. I have my Amazon author site.
Okay. Oh, yep.
So it lists the other anthologies I'm in. I'm not overly prolific. I've probably been, outside of the short story collection, I probably have stuff in, 4 other anthologies.
Yep.
But I like to think they were good stories.
Yeah. That's all right. Even if you just have one, that's a great story. Like that's all you need.
So I figure at some point, when I stop working, I have a little more time because people will say, "You want to retire?" I'm like, "Oh, heck yeah."
Yeah.
But they're like, "Well, what are you going to do?" I'm like, "I've got a few ideas."
Yeah.
And writing might be one of them.
Yeah. It all comes down to time. I do most of my writing first thing in the morning at like 6 a.m. or in the middle of the night. That's when I have time to do it. That's when you make it happen.
Yeah, I could see that. Honestly, I used to like to write on weekends. If I think I need about 5 hours because in that 5 hours, I will write, I will procrastinate, I'll write some more, I'll procrastinate some more, I'll get a snack, I'll write some more. It's a very bizarre process, but I've had times where an idea pops in my head and I could write for 4 hours straight.
We all have our own processes with it and weird times that inspiration comes to you, right? I've had that moment where I'm like, oh my God, I've been writing for 6 hours straight. And then other ones where it's like, oh my God, it's only been 30 minutes.
Yeah, it's funny. I tried doing that nano write-mo thing for November.
Oh, yeah. I can't.
And after 4 days, I realized I was behind. I was like, yeah, screw it.
Yeah.
I don't want to write like I'm punching a clock, because writing it's your own genesis. You can't sit there and say, well, that's why like professional writers, I don't know how they do it.
Oh, it's crazy.
You can't get up at 8 a.m, say, I'm going to write till noon, have lunch, go to a coffee shop, and I'm going to write from 2 to 5 at the coffee. I can't do that.
No, I can't either. I don't even, the ones where it's like they are putting out multiple novels every year or in a series, one every single year. I don't know how. It takes me a year to write a first draft. And then let alone
but you're working
the next several.
A lot of writers, this is like full time for them.
True.
If this is full time, I could do this in 3 months.
Very true.
And I have a Dunkin' Donuts that I love to go to write. There's one in Pelham, New Hampshire, that it's not that busy, at least inside.
Yeah.
So I get myself, a cold brew. I'll sit down with my laptop. Nobody bothers me, and I could write for 3 hours. I've tried doing that at Starbucks, and it's too busy. There's too many people walking around. There's too much distractions. And at home, it sometimes gets a little too quiet if I'm just sitting there sequestering myself.
Get a little scared if you're by yourself writing your horror.
No, but I have had things that I've seen that have creeped the hell out of me. So maybe if you ever do a follow-up podcast, I can tell you some of those horrific things that I've seen. But...
Definitely. You're like just drawing inspiration from horrifying things in your own life.
Yes, but I will say like a good coffee shop like Dunkin' Donuts that's dead quiet is to me my ideal place to write.
Good to know. Awesome. Thank you so much again. You're a fantastic guest. We should definitely do this again, do a follow-up.
Hopefully by then I'll have the 9th Plague out and it's received glowing reviews, fingers crossed.
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully I'll have my second book out by then. We'll see.
We have stuff to shoot for.
Yes, exactly. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.